All right, seniors, welcome once again to another episode of Miss Mikeson Reviews Frankenstein in my living room on my couch. So you have read, at this point, you should have read Letters 1 through 4, which is Robert Walton talking about his discovery of the stranger, who we learn more about in chapters 1 through 4, your most recent reading assignment. So the stranger goes over his childhood and college years. You guys are about to go to college. Hopefully your years in college are nothing like this guy's, who spends his time creeping in cemeteries and charnel houses, which are places where they store dead bodies, to watch dead human beings decay for science. So I'm going to review these chapters with you guys. So chapter 1, he goes over first how his father met his mother. His father had a friend named Beaufort who had a child. This child is Caroline Beaufort, who, after her father dies, the stranger's father marries. So there's a quote on there talking about her. He strove in chapter 1, it's like 2 pages in, all our pages are different. He strove to shelter her as a fair exotic is sheltered by the gardener from every rougher wind, and to surround her with all that could tend to excite pleasurable emotion in her soft and benevolent mind. So very much this woman is protected. But we see in these first 2 chapters, meeting Caroline, the stranger's mother, and also his eventual sister Elizabeth, we see there's this weird gender dynamic where both the stranger's mother and the stranger himself are very much like protective and sheltering of these women who are more so objects of beauty than people, I might argue. But Caroline Beaufort had gone through a lot. Her father had gotten really sick, and then they were in poverty, and she took care of him and earned money in whatever way she could. So then after their marriage, our second narrator, right? Because this is a frame narrative. He was born a spoiled little guy. I was their plaything and their idol. But this chapter, interestingly, this passage brings up the question of what parents owe their children. What do we owe the people or the things that we create and bring into the world, which becomes a super important question as we move through this novel. They didn't have another sibling, but then Caroline was going out because they're pretty well-to-do. She makes it a habit to help poorer people. So she goes out. She finds this beautiful little child in this large family filled with other dark, less beautiful children. So we have some kind of racism there. This blonde, blue-eyed child is very much angelic compared to the vagrant, the other little beggar children. So Caroline's like, I want you to be my new kid. So this is Elizabeth, and she becomes Frankenstein's cousin sister, who later, when Caroline dies of scarlet fever that she caught from Elizabeth, the mother, Caroline, is like, all I've wanted my whole life is for you two to marry. So we'll see how that turns out in future chapters. Okay, chapter 2. He talks about his childhood. Let's see. Elizabeth, my companion, contemplated with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearance of things. So she's very much sort of enmeshed in the natural world, in awe of, did you guys see that hair just float by? She's very much in awe of the things that she sees around her. But our narrator himself is more into the causes of things. How do things tick? And we see he becomes obsessed with nature and science. His friend is Henry Clerval. He's more into like stories and action. He wants to be an adventurer. But our narrator himself writes about a few pages in, "It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn. And whether it was the outward substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world." So he's like, what makes the world work? What is the secret behind all of these things in the world? So he starts learning about natural philosophy, which some of you read The Alchemist. This is sort of the first, it's not quite what we define as science, but he's learning about all of these Greek and Roman sort of philosophers that had some really crazy ideas about the way things work. Like one of them used to think that that the uterus like could move around a woman's body, and that when women had like different illnesses, they're like, well, your uterus isn't where it's supposed to be. And there were a lot of like really sexist, crazy ideas tied up into this. But he was interested in this. These natural philosophers. He mentions the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, which is part of alchemy, which you guys are going to learn more about, if you haven't already, in the podcast that I put on Classroom. But he's very much interested in these natural philosophers, this pseudoscience of alchemy, until he witnesses this thunderstorm. And this is a question that some people have trouble with typically. A most violent and terrible thunderstorm. So he writes, I remained while the storm lasted, watching its progress and curiosity with delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden, I beheld a stream of fire issued from an old and beautiful oak, which about 20 yards from our house stood. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. So he talks about the destruction, the utter destruction of this tree by electricity, and then he decides, like, well, we don't know anything about science. I had a better quote for it. Oh yeah, it seemed to me as if nothing would or could ever be known. So he's like, well, look at what just happened to this tree. It sort of scars him in a way. And he turns away from science for a while to study math, but we see science is really connected to this idea of destiny for him. So he turns away from it for now, but it will lure him back to it. And then we have a beautiful quote here. This book is really full of quotes that I just love. Thus strangely are our souls constructed, and by such slight ligaments are we bound to prosperity or ruin. And this is in the context of him deciding, like, well, will I follow math or will I follow science? Because remember, he's telling this as this sort of forlorn, shipwrecked stranger on the boat of Robert Walton. So he has this hindsight as he's telling this story. So he's able to present his childhood and this pursuit of science in terms of the destiny that sort of dooms him. Okay. Chapter 3. He goes to university, but first his mom dies. As I have said earlier, she wants them to marry. This delays his departure for a while, but he eventually goes, where he meets two professors, Mr. Krempe, professor of natural philosophy, he kind of thinks he's rude, but he really is inspired by this Mr. Waldman. And Mr. Krempy sort of echoes this disdain of science that the stranger has realized already with the cracking of the tree. Criticizes these alchemists. Good God, in what desert land have you lived where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies, which you have so greedily imbibed, are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient? You must start anew. So, and at this point, the stranger's like, yeah, I know. But he does become really sort of invested in the classes of Mr. Waldman, Monsieur Waldman, I assume, who teaches chemistry. And he realizes, like, everything he's learned about science, because he's sort of taught himself too, much like Robert Walton, our first narrator. Everything he's learned so far is sort of crap, right? It's been replaced by newer science. He writes, I was required to exchange chimeras. Chimeras are like these mythological creatures, in this context meaning non-existent, right? This natural philosophy, alchemy. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. So he's like, what do scientists really know now? Nothing. What's it good for? Nothing. But he goes to Monsieur Waldman's lecture, and he's like, holy crap, this is my calling. Science is my calling after all. And we learn who our narrator is at this moment. He's learned that even though science doesn't look like it's accomplished a lot, it has. And he says, so much has been done, he's speaking to himself, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. He's Frankenstein, the scientist, the mad scientist. More, far more will I achieve. So he becomes concerned with, in the next chapter, chapter 4, he learns more about chemistry, math, these other branches of science, right? But his primary concern, and it's a little hard to understand, but the quote is, whence, I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? Which means, from where did the principle of life proceed? What is life? He's essentially asking, where does it start? What is it? How can I recreate it? And the way that he does this, first he's got to study anatomy. He's got to study decay. So he's like, I've got to go to churchyard. I've got to go to the churchyard, the graveyard. I've got to go to the charnel houses where bodies are decaying. He writes, I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. So he's studying death to discover where life comes from. And then he uses this realization. He figures it out, you guys. He writes, from the midst of this darkness, a sudden light broke in upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect, which it illustrated, I was surprised that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. So now is the moment he's like, ha, 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 ha. I've watched all these dead bodies, and now I know. I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. So obviously, he's like, I've got to create life. And not only do I have to create life, I'm not just going to create an animal, I'm going to create a man, and he's going to be 8 feet tall. And then we see this really important quote in here. He writes, pursuing these reflections, I thought, as he works to create this man, pursuing these reflections as I thought, that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might, in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life, where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. And when I read this, this is a central quote that motivates Frankenstein, because his mother has just died. He's spending his time like consumed with this question of how to create life, but then we see underlying it is how to bring the dead back to life. And this is something that really motivated Mary Shelley as well. This question, if you look at her life and her history, her mother died like within a month of her being born. Her first baby died. Several, like more of her children died after she had them. So she's writing this, but she's writing it in the midst of this great loss, and also in the midst of this scientific discovery of electricity, and these experiments on galvanism, how to bring dead bodies back to life. So you can really see like it's written in the form of a ghost story, but there are these questions that we all struggle with, right? Like where do people go when they die? What if we could turn back time or bring the ones we have lost back to life? So we have this really human question undergirding this horror story. He talks about his state of mind. A resistless and almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. So he goes and collects all these materials of dead people. The dissecting room. So this thing he's creating isn't all human. He's getting human body parts, but he's also getting animal body parts. So he's creating this mishmash man that's going to be 8 feet tall. And then he sort of turns to lecturing Robert Walton, because remember, Victor Frankenstein, our scientist, is the stranger. We know this now. And he's telling this in hindsight. And he tells Robert Walton, the explorer going to the North Pole, if the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, not befitting the human mind. So basically what he's saying is we need balance. We can't let ourselves be consumed with this question, even though he himself has done this. We see Robert Walton himself also consumed with like discovery. I must discover a passage through the North Pole and magnetism. So it's an interesting philosophy of how you should live your life in balance, which probably as Robert Walton is hearing this, I imagine him thinking easier said than done, right? Because the stranger, Victor Frankenstein, has had this experience, this time to reflect, and he's saying, having been able to pursue his passions, it's not worth it. But we have to wonder whether someone who was in the midst of that passion would actually stop and listen to him. Okay. I kept it under 20 minutes, which I guess is okay. I want you guys to watch this because it's some important background information and respond with the question that I posted. Okay. I hope you guys are enjoying this novel. I'm really enjoying it more. This is the second time I've read it, and I have like the ending and the rest of it in mind, because the first time I taught it like reading it with my seniors, just like a step ahead of them. So I'm really enjoying knowing how it ends and going back through again and making more connections this time around. And I think it's allowing me to help you guys understand it better if you're watching these. All right. I hope you guys are taking care of yourselves. Yeah, I'll post more later. Okay, bye.